Part of the issue I think that we need to be thinking about now is what does this all mean in practical terms? And so we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at something that is a checklist, something very practical, something you can walk away with and be helpful. And just a reminder that all of the materials that we're sharing with you are going to be sent out to you shortly in the early part of next week, just so that you have this information in front of you and you can spend more time with it, as well as the link to this recording. So just don't worry, when we share things, you're going to see it. So it's all helpful that way. But what I want to share with you is a checklist that has been developed over the last few weeks as part of our thinking about how we respond to the information that you have seen in some of the research that we're talking about so far. And so, how do we welcome? How do we do this? This isn't a checklist on what you do to tell people about yourself, because what this checklist is limited in its scope to focus only on what happens when someone walks in the door. And so that, if they've taken the massive step that it takes them to do that, here are some things we think you should be aware of. And this checklist will be shared with you as well in subsequent days. Une des plus grandes choses que nous pouvons faire, c'est de se mettre dans les souliers d'une autre personne qui n'a jamais entré dans une église auparavant. De savoir comment on peut se mettre dans leur perspective, de comprendre les choses que ces gens-là n'ont pas comme habitude. Parce que nous, des fois, on est tellement pris dans nos habitudes que c'est très difficile pour nous de se mettre dans les souliers de quelqu'un qui n'a jamais mis les pieds dans une église. Alors, voici un peu la liste que nous proposons qui va nous aider à mieux nous équiper pour répondre à ce besoin. I'm using a checklist approach. I think it's just easier this way. However, I don't think that it's going to be physically possible for you to do everything all the time perfectly. So don't try to make this a perfection exercise. Make this an evolution exercise about how you do this work. So here's some of the questions that we're going to be asking in the checklist. Before I show up, was the worship time posted outside the church, on the church door, or on a sign somewhere? Just knowing what time the worship service is sometimes challenging for folks who are coming up for the first time. But also knowing that church services themselves are not necessarily the first entry point, having other activities that are posted on the church door or sign can be very helpful. Was it easy for me to know what the service time was by doing a Google search? Is there a Facebook page or a web page? Is there some place somewhere that will say what time worship is taking place? As somebody who has shown up in a number of churches to preach, you'd be surprised at how frequently I have to ask someone what time the worship service is, because it's not immediately available in any other way. And for somebody who's interested in trying to come for the first time, that's pretty important. The other thing that is very funny is that sometimes churches have multiple doors, and everyone seems to know what door to go in, except the person who's showing up for the first time. So is the entry door clearly marked so that I don't have to guess which door to use and end up hitting a bunch of locked doors before I find the door that happens to be open to let me into the church? The next thing in terms of checklist is, once I've walked through the door, am I greeted by someone who welcomes me? This is an important piece, because if I walk in and all I do is sit down and I have not been greeted by somebody, that the hoped for connection that I am expecting to have experienced has been missed. Has someone introduced themselves to me and asked me my name? Did someone introduce me to someone else in the congregation so that it's only not just that particular person? Did the person ask me something about myself or what brought me to church that day? Was I invited to sit with someone when I arrived? Or were those sitting nearby, did they introduce themselves to me? I can't tell you, in the first 6 months of my work as the regional executive minister for these three regions, I showed up unannounced in a number of churches. And the number of times I walked in, was handed a bulletin, and then sat there alone for 10 minutes before the service, sat through the entire service and walked out the door and was wished a good week. I would say that that was probably 3/4 of my experiences. I had no one even approach me. I'm not suggesting that we have to keep people very busy, but there is something there about that experience. Are there options for families that were explained when I arrived? So was there like, this is what happens with children, or some kind of explanation about whether there's activity bags in the pews or Sunday school program or children's time or whatever the case may be, or that we welcome noise of children running around the sanctuary, whatever the case may be? Was that explained if that was appropriate when I walked in the door? Once I sat down, was it easy for me to know where the bathroom was? Did someone tell me? Is the bulletin that I received or the details provided on the screen help me figure out what's going to happen next? If the details were on the screen, was I told when I walked into the space that everything would be on the screen? You remember that awkwardness that people say, I'm not going to know when I'm going to sit down or when I'm going to stand up. I'm not going to know what's going on. All of these steps are intended to help that person feel like it's not a stress or a concern about, I'm not going to fit in here. I'm not going to know what happens as we go along. So that's why those details are really important. During the service, does the bulletin or the screen provide me with all the details I need to follow the service? Are all the prayers that I am expected to speak or the responses written? And this includes the Lord's Prayer. We assume that everyone knows the Lord's Prayer in a lot of our services, but that's not always true. Are the hymns clearly announced, including which hymn book I should use? I remember how frequently I walk in and there's multiple hymn books and people are told a number and it's either said MV or VU, but no one really knows what those mean. Being very clear about which hymn book you should use has been really important in my experience. All words to the hymns are available on the screen, in the bulletin, or in the hymn book in an appropriate way. Is it clearly indicated when I should stand or sit? And here's the catch. If there's an asterisk next to the places where you're supposed to stand, make sure somewhere in the bulletin it's explained what the asterisk is supposed to mean, because the average person doesn't necessarily know that that's supposed to mean that they stand. So those kinds of details are really helpful. During the service, were there opening words that made it clear that this was a place of gathering for everybody, including those who are new? Was it suggested to me that whatever brought me there mattered and might be found or experienced in this place? When there was a movement of the whole community, this happens when we have communion, for example, or a circle prayer, or something that people do with their bodies and physical movement, that it was clearly communicated what was expected, and I was never questioning what it is I should be doing. When the offering was done, was it clear how I could participate in the offering, whether it was a donation plate coming around, or if there was a box by the entrance door, or a QR code or a web address for online donations? That was made very clear, because offerings, particularly in a post-COVID era, have changed a lot and people don't know what to expect. So sometimes they'll sit there and wonder why the basket hasn't come around, or they'll wonder where the box is supposed to be to make a donation. Those kinds of questions, being really clear about what that is. Is there a clear link online on how to donate? Are the announcements made in a way that has a clear location? I can't tell you how many times I've been to a service where somebody said, and we're going to have this Bible study at Samantha's house. And if you're new, you have no idea who Samantha is or where her house is. Or if they say, we'll be holding this particular meditation in the friendship room, where's the friendship room? Be specific about those things so that somebody who's new doesn't have to guess or feel excluded from that experience. Are the events announced in a generous and exciting manner, especially when you're asking for volunteers? Make it sound different than just, we're desperate for people, we need people. Like, careful of the tone used in those moments. Is there an emphasis in the announcement on the possibility of spiritual growth and connections with one another rather than just recruiting help? Is the language in the service used simple and easy to understand? We use so much language in our church services that require a lot of background or a lot of explanation. And sometimes they go over people's heads. Even people who've been there for generations don't necessarily know what we mean. Are churchy terms explained or unpacked for people who are brand new? After the service, if there's coffee and conversation, was I invited to join? And if there was a coffee and conversation time that I went to, did someone engage with me in conversation? I didn't feel like there was a tight-knit group that I couldn't break into. And this is important because often a newcomer is really nervous, doesn't feel like they have the skills to be able to make friends or connect with people. And so they'll stand there and feel awkward about how to speak to people. So if people are identified as official welcomers or official people who are going to be able to do that welcoming, is there a way to make sure that that happens at the coffee time or at the gathering after the service as well? Other things to think about: was the minister introduced to me or introduced themselves to me? If there's coffee and conversation, was I personally invited to join? Did the bulletin or display include information on how to reach the minister if I wanted to? Is there a phone number or an email address or something along those lines, or office hours, so that I know if I want to have a conversation with the minister, how I do that? Was I personally invited to return or felt encouraged to join the community again? Little things that make a big difference in terms of what we can do. There are probably other things that aren't on this checklist, but I wanted to check in with you to sort of give you some ideas about the kinds of things that might be helpful. And this checklist will be provided to you as part of the package that you'll be receiving early in the week. The other thing is, for those of you in the Eastern Ontario Outaouais Regional Council, your executive has had a conversation about having a guess who's coming to worship process, so that there are some folks who are going to be identified over the next number of months who might be showing up without you knowing about it, and will be there and will help check this checklist off and sort of give the chair of your council and your minister the responses of what they experienced as a newcomer in that setting. And so over the next number of months, there will be people appearing to just give you a bit of an assessment and a feel of what it's like for a newcomer to walk into your community of faith. For those of you in the other two regional councils, while that particular plan is not underway, is not part of the strategic plan in your regional councils, we will nevertheless encourage you to use this checklist just for your own purposes, just the same. And so in light of that, I'm hoping that this might be helpful. We'll be speaking a little bit more around how other types of accessibility issues will be addressed. And so we'll be getting to that in a bit. And yes, coffee time can be overwhelming. And for those of you who are fresh, it's really hard. And part of it is, it's human nature, right? We're human beings who want to connect with the people we know and we already are connected to, and we want to reconnect with them. And it's important for us to spend time. But being attentive to those who are not the ones who we regularly connect to, being intentional about that is really hugely helpful. So certainly something to consider.